back in. Today, we're going to discuss some of our top plays for week 5. We're going to go through quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end and discuss some of our favorite plays of the week. So let's go ahead and get to it. And we're going to start with the quarterback position. Now, we're not going to hit on any of the obvious guys. We're not going to talk about Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes, just a waste of time. I want to talk about more players that people are going to have more question marks about on whether they're going to play them or not. So we're going to start with Daniel Jones. He gets a matchup here against the Raiders. Now, after a down week 4, Daniel Jones and the Colts are set up well against this matchup against the Raiders. Daniel Jones has been an absolute baller, averaging 20.1 fantasy points per game, and he's still 6th in fantasy points per dropback. He's currently averaging 8.9 yards per attempt. He's also 12th in deep ball completion percentage. Now, these are recipes for big games. And now, had A.D. Mitchell not dropped the ball before he got in the end zone last week, Jones would have had a better fantasy day than he looked last week. Either way, Daniel Jones set up nicely at a bounce back spot here against the Raiders. So absolutely love Daniel Jones. I think he's a top 10 quarterback play for me this week. Next up is going to be Justin Herbert. After scoring 27 and 19 fantasy points over his first 2 games, Herbert has not topped 15 fantasy points the last 2 games. Now, there's a lot to like here with Justin Herbert. He's averaging 40.3 pass attempts per game. He's also top 5 in deep ball attempts. He was also 4th in passing yards, 8th in passing touchdowns. Now, I will say they have suffered a lot of injuries to their offensive line. Rashawn Slater is out for the year. Then last week, we lost Joe Alt to a severe high ankle sprain. Mekhi Becton suffered it was a concussion protocol. So there's a lot of injuries here to this offensive line, which is why I think they've had a lot of struggles this year running the ball and why they've went way more pass heavy than what they have in years past. If you look at this matchup here against the Commanders, this sets up really well for this team to really throw the ball because the Commanders are allowing 265.5 passing yards per game and nearly 2 passing touchdowns as well. They're also allowing the 8th most fantasy points to quarterback. I think you absolutely fire up Justin Herbert this week with absolute confidence. Let's keep it moving here. I want to talk about some other players that are now these are guys that are going to be players you probably can add off your waivers, or maybe you added this week. But the first one I want to hit on is going to be CJ Stroud. The Texans offense has been pretty much a disaster so far to start the year. Stroud finally had a decent game though last week, throwing for 233 yards and 2 touchdowns for 18.4 fantasy points. Now the Texans offensive line has been a problem all season. Which is one of the reasons Stroud is only averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game. Now, the Texans face a decimated Ravens defense this week. They're going to be without Marlon Humphreys, Roquan Smith, Matabuke, and also as well as Nate Wiggins. Now, you have others like Kyle Van Noy and Travis Jones who are also questionable for this game. I mean, it is going to be a who's who of who's playing for this defense. And it's a big reason why the Ravens are allowing 271 passing yards and over 2 passing touchdowns, as well as the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Now, with so many injuries and lack of pass rush, we could see Stroud get enough time to actually throw the ball deep, which he actually has the 10th highest deep ball completion percentage, which also spells really good things for Nico Collins. But either way, I think this is a really good spot, again, for CJ Stroud to give you that 18 to 20 fantasy points. The only concern we would have is if Lamar Jackson doesn't play. Now, they're saying that they're going to try to he's going to try to play this game. We'll see if he's able to play, especially whenever they have one more game after this and then they go on their bye. That seems to be the more of the notion that's going around that's probably what's going to happen. But there is reports today that Lamar Jackson is going to try to play this week. But either way, I think CJ Stroud sets up really nicely this week. And the only way that I don't see this going well for him is basically if they're able to just run all over the Ravens and they don't really have to open up the offense and lean on their defense, which isn't a possibility. But the opportunity is still there for him to be really efficient and have a really big game this week against this Ravens defense. Let's move over here to Sam Darnold versus the Bucs. Now, on the surface, it looks like Darnold has been pretty average as a fantasy asset this year. He's currently averaging 14 fantasy points per game, but he is 15th fantasy points per dropback. However, he only scored 5.4 fantasy points in week 1. But since that point, he's actually a QB8 in fantasy points per dropback, and he's only thrown the ball more than 30 times once, and he's still the QB14 over the last 3 games. Now, Darnold also ranks 2nd in yards per attempt, 3rd in deep ball completion percentage, and the Bucs have allowed the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So if you're looking for a quarterback this week with bye weeks here, Sam Darnold, I think, is a player you can definitely look at here this week. Now, the last quarterback here is going to be Jaxson Dart, who is fresh off his rookie debut where he dropped 20 fantasy points. While the Malik Neighbors injury definitely is going to hurt, it shouldn't matter as much this week against the Saints, who have allowed the 3rd most passing touchdowns and the 11th most rushing yards to quarterback. Overall, they have yielded 21.1 fantasy points per game to the position. Now, Dart last week rushed 10 times for 54 yards, but he also had a 35-yard run that was called back due to penalty. So he would have had close to 100 yards rushing last week had that not happened. And he did that against a far superior defense in the Chargers. So I do think Dart is a strong option for a quarterback-needy team this week that's out there searching. So Dart would be the other quarterback I talk about. Now let's move over to the running back position, and we got a lot to talk about this week with all the stuff going on with injuries and who's in, who's out. So we're going to start first with Rachaad White, who I actually have as a top 12 running back this week. Now, this is all based on the thought that Bucky Irving is going to miss, who was spotted in a walking boot and crutches today. But Todd Bowles did come out and say they're not ruling him out, that maybe he can play this week. They'll see how he feels on Friday. I highly doubt it. The dude's in a walking boot and crutches. I don't see how he's going to play this week. Seems like coach speak. But either way, if Rachaad White is able to play, I will say Rachaad White, who has been pretty limited so far this year, he's only played 31% of the snaps. He's received 5.8 carries and 2.3 targets per game. But if Bucky does miss this game, I expect White to handle the bulk of the touches with Sean Tucker playing more of a change of pace, maybe some goal line opportunity type role. Rachaad White has looked a lot better this year, especially he's been more efficient than he has in years past. He ranks 8th in yards after contact and a healthy 4.9 yards per carry. We know White is a very good pass catcher as well, so he will likely handle all of those touches. Now the Bucs are going to take on a Seahawks defense that have been absolutely crushed by pass catching running backs. They have allowed 266 receiving yards, which is easily the highest rate in the league. Overall, the Hawks have allowed the 15th most PPR points to running backs, and with a sizable role he will receive, White does make for a low-end RB1 or a high-end RB2 this week. Let's keep it moving here. Let's move over to Cam Skattebo versus the Saints. Now, in Skattebo's first start and Tracy's injury, Skattebo rushed 25 times and was targeted twice for 90 total yards. He finished with 13 fantasy points. Obviously, nothing impressive from a production standpoint, but we should take into consideration as against one of the best run defenses in the league in the Chargers. The usage is the main takeaway here for me, though. He played 73% of the snaps, and he saw 6 touches inside the red zone. Now, this week, the Giants should be in a pretty positive game script here for Cam Skattebo to see a lot of touches. In the matchup against the Saints, as they allowed the 12th most rushing yards and 5 total touchdowns for 25.3 PPR points, which is the 8th most in the league. So I really like Skattebo here. I think he's a high-end RB2. Next up is going to be Quinshon Judkins versus the Vikings. No preseason or training camp, no problem for Judkins. The last 2 weeks, Judkins is averaging 19 carries, 3 targets per game. He's also averaging 16 PPR points, which is good for the RB11 and fantasy points per game. I would like to see more uses in the passing game, though. He's only running 25% of the routes, but when given the opportunity, he does rank 16th in yards per route run. As a runner, though, he's been very good, averaging 4.5 yards per carry, and he ranks 19th in explosive run rate over that span. Now, he gets a phenomenal matchup here against the Vikings, who have struggled against opposing running backs. They have allowed the 9th most rushing yards, the 8th most rushing touchdowns, and the 12th most fantasy points to running back. Judkins is a high-end RB2 for me this week. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to Woody Marks versus the Ravens. In week 3, we saw a significant jump in usage. Now, he went from 25% of the snaps in week 2, and then he jumped to 46% in week 3. Now, he made another jump in week 4, though, where he played 58% of the snaps, 17 carries. He ran 53% of the routes, and he was targeted 5 times against the Titans. He finished with 122 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and 28 fantasy points against a really bad Titans team. Now, with a matchup against the Ravens on tap, though, he gets a better matchup that you could ask for running back. The Ravens have allowed the 5th most rushing yards, the most rushing touchdowns, and the 5th most receiving yards. Overall, they have been gashed for 35 fantasy points per game, which is by far the most in the league. Let's move over to the Cardinals backfield. And there's been a ton of conversation about this because it's been a wild 48 hours for Trey Benson. It went from he got dinged up against the Seahawks and may or may not miss week 5, but then today's news, he was placed on IR and he's going to miss 4 to 6 weeks. And now there's been plenty of discussion today with Amari DiMercato and Michael Carter. Now, going back to last season when James Conner missed week 17 and 18, Michael Carter was actually the workhorse. He handled 70% of the snaps. He averaged 16 carries and 3 targets, and he scored 10 fantasy points and 16 fantasy points in those 2 games. Now, it should be mentioned, though, that Trey Benson and DiMercato were also out for those weeks, too. So it's really hard to take a lot from that. But I will say, we jumped to last week. It was Michael Carter who came in during the second quarter when Benson initially got banged up, and he ended up playing that entire drive until Benson came back in. Now, I'll also say today, Michael Carter was speaking to the media, and he said that he was excited to start this game. So it sounds like he didn't just make that up. I'm assuming that the coaching staff told him that he's going to be the starter here. And so my best guess is that Michael Carter is going to handle the early work and the goal line work, while DiMercato is going to be the pass catching work. And I think he'll mix in some on early downs. But it does seem like Michael Carter is at least going to be that guy. And against the Titans, though, this should be a script here that I think the Cardinals can easily control here. And I do have Carter ranked higher than DiMercato because I do think that this is a matchup where they're not going to have to throw the ball very much. And I think that plays much more into Michael Carter's hands. And so I project probably a 60-40 split here in terms of overall touches. I think both of them are flex options, but I just think Michael Carter's the better play of the two, at least for this week. So let's keep it moving here and let's move over to another running back that this one might be a little bit more thin, but I do like what I'm seeing here in a matchup in a week with all these injuries plus bye weeks. I think Kendre Miller is kind of interesting this week. A little bit similar to Woody Marks, not as high of a mark here, but we're starting to see an uptick in usage for Kendre Miller. Last week was the high mark where he saw 11 carries, turned that into 65 yards and a score for 12 and a half PPR points. Now he's not involved at all as a pass catcher because that's Alvin Kamara's role. He has that unlocked, but he ended up playing around 35% of the snaps. And this week, though, he gets a great matchup with the Giants without Malik Neighbors. This game feels like that it could be a little bit more closer than the 31-19 game that they just played against the Bills. While it is a little bit thin, Miller should be viewed as a low-end RB3 this week against a Giants defense that has allowed the fifth most PPR points to the position. Now, a couple other guys that I wanted to mention really quickly. I think Justice Hill's also really interesting, who's much more of the preferred pass catching back. If they're without Lamar Jackson, I think you probably see a lot more of Justice Hill because they're probably going to be trailing and a negative game script here, which hurts Derrick Henry. And so I think Justice Hill is actually a pretty interesting option in PPR formats. Let's move over to the wide receivers. We're going to start with Quentin Johnston here, who I think we're to the point now where I think we should start admitting that Quentin Johnston is the wide receiver one in this offense, and he might actually be a dude. 9.3 targets for him. He's averaging 24% target per out run rate. And he's also 18th in first read target share. He's fifth in deep targets, eighth in red zone targets, and he's averaging 19.9 fantasy points per game. He's also 15th in yards per out run, eighth in yards per team pass attempt. We're on to full on breakout. And I think that he is the Chargers' best wide receiver right now. After a couple of weeks, it was like, oh, we've kind of seen this before. He showed in spurts last week, but so far through 4 weeks, he is clearly the team's best wide receiver. And I actually think Keenan Allen is actually behind him. And so I think both Johnston and Keenan Allen are phenomenal plays this week, as the Commanders have allowed the ninth most receiving yards, tied for the sixth most touchdowns, and the eighth most PPR points. So Quentin Johnston is a wide receiver one for me this week. Let's keep it moving over to Michael Pittman, who never gets enough respect. I feel like every offseason we give all this hype to Josh Downs, and absolutely nobody talks about Michael Pittman, which is absolutely wild to me because Michael Pittman has produced. He has produced a wide receiver 2 season in his career, but it's just all the hype has always went to Josh Downs. And right now, Michael Pittman looks like the best wide receiver in this Colts offense. He's averaging 7.3 targets. He's drawing a 25% target per out run rate. He's averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game, which is wide receiver 14. He's also 24th in yards per out run, 21st in yards per team pass attempt. And outside of week 2, when he was shadowed by Patrick Surtain, he has scored 15.1, 19.3, and 20 fantasy points in those other 3 games. He is a high-end wide receiver 2 for me this week against a Raiders defense that has allowed the 4th most receiving yards, tied for the 6th most touchdowns, and the 4th most PPR points. So Michael Pittman has went from just a flex play to now he is a every week starter for me for the foreseeable future. Let's keep it moving. Let's move over to Chris Olave versus the Giants. Olave has absolutely been peppered with targets. He's seen a ridiculous 10.8 targets per game with a 28% target per route run rate. And he's also seen a 35% first read target share. Now, despite all that, he's still only seeing 12.4 PPR points per game, but his expected 16.6 fantasy points ranks 7th among all wide receivers. The Saints have had a rough set of opponents through the first 4 games, but I do think this matchup against the Giants should allow him to see a little bit more of a ceiling type game. The Giants have allowed the 2nd most receiving yards, the 11th most touchdowns, and the 2nd most PPR points to position. I think Chris Olave is an absolute solid top 20 wide receiver 2 for me this week. Let's move over to Stefon Diggs. Now, it's been a slow start for Stefon Diggs, which should have been expected considering he was coming off a torn ACL. However, in week 4, he played 67% of the snaps and ran a route on 84% of the dropbacks. He also drew 7 targets, which was a 41% target share, and he turned that into 6 receptions for 101 yards and 16 PPR points. Now he gets this revenge game against the Bills, who have yielded the 6th most touchdowns to wide receiver. I think Stefon Diggs is an absolute solid wide receiver 3 play this week, and he looks like he's finally emerged after they kind of slow played him a little bit as this team's number 1 wide receiver, which is kind of what we were expecting after all of the strong reports from him in preseason and training camp. So Stefon Diggs, I think, is a really good play this week against the Bills. Now, I want to talk about some dart throws, maybe some guys if you're desperate, especially with all the injuries we've had and bye weeks and everything. I want to mention some of these players because I know a lot of people are scrambling to try to find some players to play this week. So first I'm going to talk about is Elic Ayomanor against the Cardinals. Ayomanor is averaging 6.3 targets. He's been targeted on 33% of the team's red zone targets as well, and he's utilized as a deep threat in this offense. He's received 38% of the air yards, 17th among all wide receivers. there is some volatility with this profile, but with 4 teams on bye this week, I do think Ayomanor makes for a very decent flex option against the Cardinals defense that has allowed the 13th most PPR points to the position. So let's move over to Darius Slayton. Now, while Slayton has been on the field for 98% of the routes this season, he's only seen a 10% target share. Now, obviously, Malik Neighbors soaks up some majority of the targets. We do have a small sample size, though, with Malik Neighbors out last season to kind of look at here. Because in those 2 games that Malik Neighbors missed, Slayton saw 11 targets in week 5. He turned that into 8 catches, 122 yards, and a score for 26.2 PPR points. And then in week 6, he saw another 11 targets where he hauled in 6 of them for 57 yards and another 11.7 PPR points. I do think the Giants will try to lean on the run here, but if they are pushed, I do think Slayton looks like a solid option with Jaxson Dart at quarterback. Slayton is a worthy flex option against a Saints defense that has allowed the 15th most PPR points to the position. I know other questions are going to be about Wan'Dale Robinson. I actually prefer Slayton to Wan'Dale Robinson. I think Wan'Dale Robinson is fine in PPR formats, but outside of the career game that he had against the Cowboys, he's never really been that ultra productive. I mean, if you think about it last year, dude had 140 targets, like almost 700 receiving yards. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. So he is a short yardage merchant. Everything he touches is right at the line of scrimmage. He does not see a ton of downfield work outside of that week 2 game against the Cowboys, where that's Darius Slayton's bag. And so Darius Slayton, for me, I think is a really decent play this week. And I'm higher on him than Wan'Dale Robinson. Now, I can't not talk about the 49ers wide receivers right now. Both Juwan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall have both already been ruled out, as well as Brock Purdy at this point. And it's going to leave Mac Jones, Demarcus Robinson, Kendrick Bourne, and Jake Tonjes as the main pass catchers here. But they also will have, obviously, Christian McCaffrey. But I do think of this ragtag group, I think Kendrick Bourne profiles the best. He's been targeted 10 times the last 2 games, all these other guys playing. And I think he's probably the safest option. The Rams have struggled against opposing wide receivers, allowing the 12th most PPR points. But so I think if you're desperate, Kendrick Bourne could, I think, return like some wide receiver 4 value. Maybe he gets to be a wide receiver 3 this week. But I think of the wide receivers they have, which is like all the Chiefs' old wide receivers, like Kendrick Bourne, Demarcus Robinson, MVS, and Sky Moore. I think Kendrick Bourne is the one that makes the most sense. Let's move over to the tight ends, and we'll get out of here. I want to talk about first, it's going to be Tommy Tremble versus the Dolphins. With so many injuries to the Panthers pass catchers, Tommy Tremble stepped up last week, playing 75% of the snaps. He ran 70% of the routes and was targeted 8 times. And he's turned that into 5 catches, 54 yards, and a score for 15.2 PPR points. Tremble does figure to be heavily involved this week against the Dolphins, who has allowed the 3rd most PPR points to tight ends. So I think Tommy Tremble is actually a really strong play, kind of a top 15 tight end for me this week. Next up is going to be Darren Waller on the other side of that game. Waller returned last week against the Jets and immediately let his presence fell, scoring 2 touchdowns. Now, should be mentioned, he only played 27% of the snaps, but it was clear the plan to get him involved in the red zone, and it worked. Now, with Tyreek out for the year, we could see Waller earn a bigger role in the offense. Now, I don't think he's going to see some massive workload like Jonnu Smith did last year. I don't see that happening, considering Waller is 33 years old, has a very lengthy injury history. But I do think he's probably going to get ramped up a little bit more and should see somewhere between 5 to 7 targets in this game with a red zone role. So I do think that is something that's valuable. And the Panthers have also allowed the 8th most PPR points to tight end. So Darren Waller, I think, is also another option you could look at. Next up is going to be Mason Taylor for me against the Cowboys. He's now drawn 13 targets the last 2 weeks. In week 4, he actually hauled in 5-7 for 65 yards. The rookie tight end looks like he's starting to earn a much bigger role in the offense and ran a route on 90% of dropbacks last week. But he gets a really good matchup against the Cowboys, and there should be, once again, plenty of opportunities for Mason Taylor this week. I don't think he has an incredibly high ceiling because it's still a team that wants to run the ball a ton. But if they fall behind, Mason Taylor's clearly emerged the number 2 target here behind Garrett Wilson. And lastly, I want to hit on Theo Johnson versus Saints. Theo Johnson, if you're not familiar, is a big athletic tight end who hails from tight end U, Penn State. If you are familiar, he boasts a 98 percentile speed score, a 96 percentile burst score, and he's 6'6", 260 pounds. And he's already seen the 2nd most red zone targets of any tight end this season. And now with Malik Neighbors out, there should be plenty more opportunities to go around. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the 2nd-year tight end break out and be the safety blanket for Jaxson Dart. And it's a great matchup this week against the Saints. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. If you have any start-sit questions, we'll be sure to help you out. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.